Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all our participants joining from across the globe. It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you all to this panel to discuss the BRICS agenda for women's leadership and women-led economic growth. We are meeting at a time when the world is experiencing a human and economic crisis, which threatens to roll back years of hard-won economic and social gains for women. A year and a half into the crisis, it is abundantly clear that women have faced a disproportionate burden of the COVID-19 shock. This is because they work predominantly in sectors such as hospitality, tourism, restaurants, and retail that have been hit hardest by the lockdowns. They are also the main caregivers at home and have had to carry the burden of unpaid care work at home. They've had to drop out of the labor market as schools have closed. In developing countries, women are overrepresented in the informal sector, where they face lower pay, less job security, and lower social protection. In these countries, girls have dropped out from schools more compared to boys to help in household work. For the recovery to be inclusive and equitable, it needs to be women-centered. Gender equity and women empowerment are not just a moral imperative today, but also an economic one. Gender empowerment is critical for the economic well-being of both men and women, and for societies as a whole. Empowering women through improving access to health, education, earning opportunities, labor markets, rights, and political participation can be an economic game changer for any country. There exists a large body of research that corroborates these assertions. For instance, it is well established that gender equity in the labor market can deliver significant gains to national income. Better economic opportunities and equal pay for women not only lower gender inequality, but also lower income inequality. And lower income inequality in turn brings with it higher and more robust economic growth. While it seems fairly clear that investing in women would be the key to an inclusive and robust economic recovery post-pandemic, policy responses and recovery efforts thus far appear to have largely ignored the needs of women. This is particularly striking given the very clear gendered implications of this crisis. I would like to start the discussion today by asking each one of you, what policy measures or strategies do you feel need to be put in place to ensure that women are at the heart of the economic recovery process, be it in terms of improving labor force participation, women-led financial inclusion, or women-led entrepreneurship? Also, what role do you see of the BRICS in coming together and supporting this agenda for women-led economic growth? I'd like to give each speaker 5 minutes for their opening remarks, and we will begin with the speaker from Brazil, Dr. Rezende. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Good morning to all of you. It's a great honor to be here. I'll get started, for the time is very short. The COVID-19 pandemic has deepened Brazilian expressive structural asymmetries and led to retrogress in several aspects, especially regarding female participation in the labor market and violence against women. The impacts of the pandemic were different because of the gender, race, and class inequalities in our social structure. In Brazil, women, especially Black and poor women, suffered the most with this great crisis. It is due to a great extension to the disproportionate responsibility upon women regarding care, both in non-paid domestic work and paid work in the labor market, as seen in the health sector and other services. Regarding the labor market, women have faced income loss and unemployment increase, and the female participation rate has fallen below 50%, returning to the 1990 level. Considering the increase in the women's vulnerability to domestic violence, it's noteworthy that the Brazilian emergency number for anonymous denunciation of domestic violence, called Ligue 180, has reported an increase of 27% in the number of calls. Despite these facts, the executive branch of the Brazilian state has not yet presented any economic recovery plan with a gender perspective. The point of view of the federal government, as shown in the document called Brazil After COVID-19, published by IPEA, emphasizes fiscal austerity, the reduction of the role of the state, privatization, deregulation, labor market flexibilization. In this agenda, there is no room for any discussion related to gender equality to flourish. Therefore, women must be, in all the diversity, included and represented in the decision-making arena. But for this to happen, they must be in positions of leadership, which they are not. In Brazil, female participation in politics is very low. There are only 3 female ministers. Less than 13% of the Brazilian cities are run by female mayors. There's only 1 female governor among 27, and both the Senate and the Federal Chamber of Deputies have only 15% of women. Notwithstanding, the women's bench in Congress has acquired some influence. Even though their participation in politics is low, when they do get the chance to act, the results tend to be fantastic. Regarding their role as mayors in Brazilian cities, a recent study published by the University of São Paulo in partnership with the University of Barcelona has shown that there has been 44% less deaths and 30% less hospitalizations in cities governed by women. The authors conclude that the female mayors managed the COVID-19 crisis better by adopting more frequently non-pharmacological preventive measures, such as mandatory use of masks, social isolation rules, and massive testing of the population. In the federal legislative branch, one can notice several bills presented by Congresswomen aiming the post-pandemic landscape with a gender bias. They have, for instance, proposed quotas for the financing of women, including Black women, in federal public banks, lower interest rates for micro and small enterprises controlled and run by women, 30% quotas for women in big companies and public enterprises boards, and tax incentives for companies that hire vulnerable women, either victims of domestic violence or those responsible for poor households. Aside that, they have also proposed the creation of a program to prevent gender and race inequality inside enterprises. Considering all these challenges, one might conclude that specific policies must be designed to address gender and race inequalities, to shed light upon the relevance of the labor related to care, and to increase women participation in positions of decision-making. The Brazilian state must reflect upon these aspects to recover what has been lost and to advance towards a more equitable society for men and women. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that perspective from Brazil. And now we turn to Russia. Dr. Panova, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be part of this forum and really honored to be speaking on about those issues. Definitely, as both the moderator and first speaker have said, the COVID-19 have impacted even further general disbalances that women are experiencing and suffering. And the COVID-19 pandemic have put us their place in sufficient place the women have in leadership in the spotlight. Definitely, we could see, if looking at the example of Prime Minister of Finland, none of the BRICS countries, Sanna Marin, under her leadership, it was possible to take effective measures. And in fact, this country went through waves of COVID-19 pandemic with their biggest anti-record incidence rates. And this is because she focused her policies on issues of equality, ecology, and fair social security. And what we see now in the world is that despite the fact that 26 years ago we've adopted Beijing Platform for Action for Women, while no country has fully delivered on the commitments of it, nor is close to it, and BRICS are not the exception to this unfortunate trend. And in fact, BRICS are also tend to be ranked lower, and even some than developed or even some developing countries by various international indices such as WEF Global Gender Gap Index or OECD SDG Gender Index and or UNDP Gender Development Index. And in this regard, we do have the situation when BRICS members have overall high performance in education and health, but lag behind in economic and especially political participation. But that said, with women being on the front lines for education and health, that is why women suffered more than men during the COVID pandemic, because they had to not only be in the social sectors, but also had to take care of their families, be it children, be it elderly, be it people with disabilities. This laid an additional burden. It is also clear, and BRICS economies are among their hardest hit, that women occupied in informal sectors of economy, unpaid informal sectors of economy. There is, in some of our countries, lack of quality childcare and elderly care, and this needs introduction of a higher level of social infrastructure for all of our countries. There are also unmet financing needs of women-owned businesses. We had last year launched finally the Women Business Alliance. It's definitely a good start, but it is believed not to be enough to really deal with the problem, and we need to offer legal perspectives in order to help this overcome, and also overcoming stereotypes. Another problem is that, and I think this is probably the basis, and I've been talking about consistently, in BRICS, there is a lack of quality sex disaggregated data, because only having this data, we would be able to make necessary conclusions in order to see which sectors of economy, which sectors of our lives are hit hardest, where women are hit hardest, and what necessary measures need to be taken in the first place in order to overcome their problems, be it unpaid care work, be it social infrastructure, be it, for example, IT infrastructure as well, because the pandemic led us much more faster into fourth industrial revolution. We all had to go fully digitalized. And unfortunately, in many cases, especially in remote or rural areas, women were hit hardest with lack of their access to digital technologies, which would be able to provide and facilitate their lives and also the lives of their children. Because in many families, for example, there is just one computer, and a working mother in a lockdown situation will have to be trying to go between all the kids who need to go to school via this computer and also work herself in order to sustain for her family. I would ask to draw your attention to their toolkit, Women Economic Empowerment and BRICS, which we adopted last year. This was a research, and this toolkit could offer rapid and targeted response to alleviate the adverse impact on women and girls caused by COVID-19 pandemic, but also to offer a long-term solutions to the problems that women run into. And I think we're probably, together with their statistics, sex disaggregated data, together with working with our legal structures, working with our businesses, Women Business Alliance. We should be further directing our research in order to provide more solutions like I've already named. I can continue talking, but I think I will stop here and then I'll leave some space for answering questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panova. That was very interesting. And I think the point that you raised about the importance of data and having this disaggregated data by gender is so important, because some of our policy discussion happens in this vacuum of data where we really don't know what the impact of certain policies have been on women. In fact, I'd go a step further and add that sometimes, we don't define women's work correctly, and that's part of the reason that our statistics also show a low female labor force participation rate when these women are in fact working. So I hope we'll be able to come back to some of those questions later in the discussion. But I'd now like to turn to Professor Wu from China.
Okay, thank you. I am Wu Huifang from China Agricultural University. And I am very honored to be invited to this forum to share with you about how rural women are organized to contribute to the economic growth in China during the pre- and post-pandemic period. As you may know, the Chinese government has accomplished the poverty alleviation mission in last year. And also, women occupied more than half of the poor population. But during the past years, women also have enjoyed quite well improvement in their livelihood and also their family and public welfare. And during the poverty alleviation and then to the rural vitalization that started this year, rural women have been organized and motivated to be economically active, so as to improve their income. I've seen many failed cases and many more successful cases, since my main research field is about the rural women issues and also women and poverty. For those successful cases I encountered, I studied, I concluded 3 common characteristics for those for how to enable rural women to contribute and to be active in the rural economy. Firstly, it is the women advantaged industries, including livestock breeding, like farm-based tourism or agro-tourism, or this kind of tourism service. And second characteristic is the e-commerce, the fast development of e-commerce in China that has enabled women to go beyond their small region or the mountainous regions to reach the big market in this country. And the last but not the least is the organization, either at the village level or higher level by different organizations. These policies and actions at different level has included rural women as micro entrepreneurs and productive labor force in the country yard based and e-commerce based economy. And those have been very important for family livelihoods and rural economy in our country. So when I go to those cases and pay attention to how women's lives have been changed and how women feel about those changes regarding their economic opportunities, we are able to examine the inclusion of women in rural economy in Chinese context. That is, Firstly, rural women are not negative and disadvantaged groups, but due to the resource and their capacity limitation, that they are very difficult to be independent individual actors. Secondly is that rural women are organized, but they are not naturally organized. They need to be helped by the local women's federation, since China has a different women's federation at different levels, or other outside power like some NGOs. And thirdly, during the COVID-19 pandemic period, rural women were very active in economy and also in rural governance. They are not suddenly. They did not become suddenly active. That is because their sustainable capacity building, being organized and empowered, so that they are more more positive in those important cases. And fourthly, that is following the above 3 points, that rural women need to be organized, to be stimulated and motivated to contribute to the rural economic development. By this, I have 3 suggestions for rural women's contribution, or we say women-led rural economic growth. That is first, to enhance the women's organization at grassroots level. Secondly, to strengthen the roles of women's federation at grassroots level. Thirdly, China still needs stronger gender mainstreaming for rural economic supportive policies and actions, including credits, trainings, and cultural activity supports, and so on. And my last point is, apart from all this, we need to see that rural women are still in the penny economy. I say penny economy, that is low profit, which reflects how power operates within the village, family, and family business. That women are facing greater pressure than men to quit from the business and the productive world, especially when facing family difficulties, social bias, or economic stress. So that to improve or to empower women to be more active in rural economy, that we need go further, go beyond the economic policies, and go to the social aspects, and to see the social, cultural, and also the policy indicators. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wu, for turning the attention to the rural, because quite frankly, we forget this urban-rural divide in this debate, and it's so important because much of the workforce, particularly the female workforce, continues to reside in rural areas in many of the BRICS countries. And now I'd like to turn to Professor Mosetsa from South Africa.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to interact with the BRICS family, and I wish we could have met in a different context. Physically, I would have loved to be in India. I'm glad that the BRICS family is still safe, relatively safe in these conditions, during these conditions, and we can still meet and keep the family alive. I want to say a few things about South Africa, and echo some of the sentiments that my colleagues have also shared with us. COVID-19 only compounded what was already a difficult positions for women, with particular emphasis on the youth in South Africa, and I'm hearing also in the broader BRICS family. COVID-19 happens in a context of rising inequalities in South Africa, declining growth, high levels of poverty, unemployment, and also declining investments. It also happens in a particular socio-cultural context of high gender-based violence in the country. COVID comes in the picture, and it only exacerbates those contradictions that we face in South Africa. It is for that reason that South Africa implemented or introduced its COVID recovery plan with an emphasis on particular sectors that you would also note have a lot of women as participants: food security, infrastructure, energy, and tourism. I think what was particularly interesting about our experience in terms of how government has responded to the challenge compounded by COVID-19 has been the notion of gender mainstreaming in all of these sectors, in all of how we want to respond to the pandemic and moving beyond the pandemic. And it is something that I want us to hold on to as I think through what gender mainstreaming means for the BRICS family. And I want to propose that as we think about what could be our recommendations coming from India this year, we foreground what I think is gender mainstreaming with an emphasis on youth, on all of our key pillars as we think about them in India in 2021. In global governance, how do we mainstream gender in global governance and our initiatives around global governance? In international security, we know that at most when we have conflicts in the different spaces, those conflicts affect our mostly women and the young, given that they'll be the most vulnerable. But also in trade and investment, how do we foreground gender mainstreaming as a BRICS family in trade and investment in finance? My favorite topic these days is around how do we mainstream gender? How do we do gender mainstreaming in science, technology, and in innovation and digitization of our economies, of our societies? It is possible. I think that coming out of BRICS 2021, hosted by our friends and colleagues and comrades in India, to think about BRICS women in science and technology and innovation. What are the practicalities that we can think about in this meeting and beyond around BRICS and science? Because we will not ever get to resolve the digital divide that we are talking about if we do not have practicalities in health. For example, what we are dealing with now is COVID-19. Are we thinking about how vaccines are being rolled out and on which women are being prioritized? Are they of a particular age, of a particular gender? And for us as BRICS and our mandate, are they of a particular class? Are they in the urban areas only, or are they also in the rural areas that my friend in China is also talking about? Finally, I want also to echo what Victoria has and the sterling work that she's been doing in always reminding us that with data is power. If we have data and understanding how we experience poverty, inequality, or even development, we are able to foreground certain initiatives coming from BRICS. I am heartened that the toolkit on economic empowerment with a focus on women that Victoria has successfully led is out there for us to learn from. How about we have other similar toolkits in global governance, international security, trade, investment, finance, science and technology, and innovation, and even health? I think there's more that we need to do as a BRICS space to shift the discourse, and it needs to shift now by prioritizing gender mainstreaming with an emphasis on youth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was nice to hear not just the South African perspective, but also what role the BRICS can play collectively in bringing these issues to the fore. And finally, I'd like to turn to our speaker from India, Dr. Kumaramangalam. Muted.
My apologies. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. I find myself, quite challenged after speaking, after 4 such fantastic perspectives that have been presented by my colleagues from the other BRICS countries. Let me try and be as brief as possible and not repeat what has already been said before me. In wanting or the agenda for recovery after COVID-19, there are some things that are known and I think which are common across countries. That women have faced greater deprivation, greater violence, reduced nutrition, reduced job opportunities, access to education, in fact, generally access to everything across the board, a loss of financial autonomy and security. Now, if we are to come out of COVID successfully, and I would like to add sustainably, women must be at the center of this entire effort. In women's hands often lies the sustainability of any initiative, whether it's economic or social or cultural and political. I would like to start with the fact that political opportunity for women is far too little in all the BRICS countries. Ironically, the countries that have very high political participation of women are all in Africa. Rwanda, Cuba, Bolivia, and I think the US is at number 75 with 23.5%. India has barely 13%. I think the figures for the other four BRIC countries may be a little better, but not much. Without political opportunity, especially at the higher levels, at the decision-making levels, education, of course, is necessary. So is financial training, skilling, autonomy, etc. But if we don't have women at that level of political decision-making, you will find very often that even though a lot of talk is going on in seminars, even in parliament, etc., in the democracies or in any of our major political meetings that take place in our countries, implementation lags behind. But I would also like to say that the second most important thing, or actually on par with politics, is education. Women still lag far behind in education in most of our countries, perhaps not so much in China, because I don't know how much data I have seen with regard to education, specifically education for women in China. But I think in all the other countries, women's education lags far behind. And by education, I also mean skilling, which means talking about financial skills that women must have if they are to become autonomous and independent. Also, technical skills. What my friend Sarah was saying about women's involvement in the STEM, that is science and technology, which is still very, very sad in most countries. Also, we need to close the digitization gap that women often suffer from. Across the world, poor women and women generally have far less access to any form of digitization. There have been some success stories, I think, across all of our countries. In India, there have been, especially with regard to finance. A direct benefit transfer has become a huge success in India, even during the COVID period. And that has helped stave off hunger. Many problems that could have been exacerbated and much worse if we did not have that in place, would have been much worse. Millions of women, crores of women have benefited from this. Women also need access to finance. We need hand-holding, whether it is in business, whether it is in education, whether it is just in understanding health and nutrition. We need access to tech. Access to tech, not meaning just information technology, but access to technical skilling, which most of us, we lag behind. The few of us who are here on this screen today are extremely lucky. We've had access to this sort of tech and we're able to use it. And, to also gain not only our own personal autonomy and authority, but also be able to talk to other women. I also think that the COVID pandemic is an opportunity that presents itself to all our countries, where in a sense we can start replanning by introducing the gender aspect into every plan that we make, regardless, whether it is environment, whether it is finance, whether it is tax, whether it is education, whether it is in, IT, whether it is anything. I mean, women must be at the center of all this planning. Because let me repeat that if we are to move forward and move forward sustainably, just move forward is not enough. This year, I think all of our countries have had terrible, terrible problems with nature showing her anger towards us. Floods, fires, typhoons, etc. And we've lost innumerable lives. So women are always at the center of any sort of environmental effort that has been successful. In India, many years ago, there was the Chipko movement where we had a sort of regreening of a whole state in India, a whole province in India, because women actually came out and had their say, made sure their voices were heard, and made sure that there was follow through. In India, we have 13 lakh women at the grassroots level in politics, but only 13% at the highest level. So look at where the gap is. There's a huge number of women who fall out somewhere in between in the process of getting to the top. Many women have broken many glass ceilings all over the world, especially in our BRICS countries, but we still need much more. As we all know, women are in the informal sector. In the informal sector, they need facilitations, creches, transport to and from work, access to IT so that they have access to their own money and control, autonomy over their own money, maternity leave, etc., etc. There are many things that we can do. These are the smaller things, and many countries have already done it. I would like to add that, it's fantastic that Victoria was talking about that toolkit. What I would like to see is many more toolkits in many more fields. And also, if in the BRICS countries, we can share best case scenarios and stories. China has probably got extremely good networking in their rural areas, which India does not yet have, and many other countries of the world don't. It would be very good if we could share the successful stories and the successful initiatives that each of our countries has taken. Not everybody can be successful at everything, but also all our countries have got specific, specific projects or policies that we have implemented and which have been made a great difference and closed the gender gap. Now, there is a huge gap even in entrepreneurship in gender. One of the biggest things we lack is access to finance. E-commerce, as pointed out by Professor Wu, is a hugely empowering tool, and it must be used more often. It must also, we need the networks to be able to actually successfully conduct e-commerce. We need the skilling to be able to conduct e-commerce. And women, along with education, must be skilled. I keep saying this, that, education is just not enough. I studied 50 years ago. I'm extremely highly educated. But I had to relearn so many things along with the IT revolution that's come. Every day, things are changing. There is a joke that used to be made in my office that, when I first thought about blockchain, little did I think it was artificial intelligence. I thought it was something to do with financing. And then when I get into it and start learning it, I realize that I am one of those lucky ones, as I say, who has access to information, to skilling. Most women lack this access. This access must become a part of all policies of every BRICS country. And wherever we have had successfully implemented policies, this should be shared. Yes, there will be differences, cultural, social, etc., differences between our countries. But basically, women have the same ambitions, the same skills, the same deprivations across the world. And if we can partner together, to actually close these gaps, then that is, I think, that would be one of the biggest successes of any recovery story. Let me just give some figures. This is again to come back to political participation. Rwanda has 61.3% women in their parliament, and you should see the pace at which that country is actually moving forward in the last 5 years. I think we all know about it. Cuba has 53.2%, Bolivia has 53.1%. Ironically, the only so-called developed or Western country in the top 10 in this is Sweden with 46.1%. Like I said, even the US is number 75 with 23.56%, and many of us are way below that with less than 10% or less than 15% of women in politics or in public, in public policy, etc. planning. The COVID epidemic has shown that, women and girls have to be taken along during development, whether it's health, education, etc. And this is an opportunity that all of us have, all the BRICS countries, to close the gap, to work together, and to support each other in, in a sustainable path towards redevelopment, let me say, not just development. Most of us already have a fair deal of development in our countries, but a sustainable path to recovery and a resilient path to recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, ma'am. I think it was wonderful that you elaborated more on the idea of political participation, because that's really critical to the women-led economic recovery. And we've had a very interesting discussion so far, and we have so many questions. I hope we can accommodate all of them in the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to have to pick and choose which questions I will take. So let me start with Professor The question directed to you is that can gender-based reservation in different employment and education sectors be a possible catalyst for women-led economic growth, or would it further accentuate the gender divide? And I'd request you to just take 2 minutes, because then I have one final closing question for all the panelists.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I can only assume where it's coming from. I think it will be foolhardy for us to interact with any sector in any society in any way if we do not have gender equality. And gender equality means that everyone, regardless of your gender, you are equally represented. Education is the most important pillar to get us to that equality. So I would vouch for that. I think in employment, as someone has said, in employment, there are many other challenges there. It's in those who are in full-time employment in the formal sector, the issues around pay gap between men and women doing the same job. It's also around the hierarchy. Are they CEOs, or are we mainly in the lower ends? And in the informal economy, I think that's where the majority of women are. And I think we need to make sure that we prioritize those sectors. So I think for us, for this session and for BRICS, it is supposed to be something that we highlight and we keep on reminding ourselves, and we work at it. I think, yes, let's talk about it, but let's work at it, and let's see it as through recommendations that we give to our heads of states. Thanks.
Thank you. It's interesting you touched on the formal-informal divide, because that's precisely the next question, and that's directed to Dr. Pranova. And the question is, can the BRICS Women Business Alliance be harnessed to bring more women into formal work?
Well, I think when we're talking about Women Business Alliance, we're talking about ladies from 5 countries who are in entrepreneurship, who would be able to create a network and work out necessary solutions that they see, looking at the barriers from their perspectives in their countries and generally in BRICS, that do have that female businesses, but entrepreneurship in general have, and thus offered solutions both to BRICS Business Council and to our governments. But further developing on that, so yes, it could be one of the ways from this network to bring solutions to bring out more ladies to formal work. But I'd like to further continue on that with supporting what Sarah has just said about education, because there are two pillars that I want to mention in this regard. First of all, from the point of view of Women Business Alliance, but also wider, this is education for ladies who want to create their own startups, who want to go into entrepreneurship. For example, we have several courses like Google together with Sberbank, or a Lady 007, it's called, and also their Russian representative for WBA is the lady who is providing for such training with the Global Rustrada and Anestro. So those courses are of ultimate importance, because they would show ladies how they should start their work and what are the necessary steps. But another one, it should go even early, and it should go to our schools. And this is about education, teaching both boys and girls that they should have equal opportunities, that we have to be bringing generally out all the stereotypes, which, for example, say still in Russia, that women should only sit at home, raise kids, and be in the kitchen. There's still quite very popular view, like 71% of, including women themselves, view it. So those stereotypes should be broken already in school. So I think education is important from those two pillars. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. No, the social and the cultural norms which define what women should be doing and shouldn't be doing definitely need to be tackled at the earlier stage, and education plays a very important role in addressing that. And one area particularly where these norms really play out is when women choose to be entrepreneurs, and that is particularly challenging, especially in a country like India. If a woman chose to go to do, regular salaried work as opposed to being an entrepreneur, the social cultural norms are even more binding. And there's also a question on this, in fact, which I would turn to Dr. Rezende for, which is that what specific steps can be taken by the BRICS to encourage women entrepreneurship? I mean, be it in terms of social cultural norms or any other factors that you see.
Well, I believe that it's crucial that women have more help from the governments regarding the care work, as I have highlighted in my presentation, including for entrepreneurship, because not only we need credit facilitated, we need low injury taxes and education, but we need to most the chain in the care work, because women are exhausted. In Brazil, we don't have the gap regarding kindergarten and schools that will accept the children so that women can go to the labor market is huge. We don't have room available for all the children, and we need them to be in kindergartens and schools so that women can produce. It's quite a huge challenge to increase entrepreneurship in Brazil. The informality is very, very, very high. Women have no access or low access to credit, and that's the way we need it. We need to improve access to credit, and we need desperately to improve our care system here, which we don't have. Women are by themselves, and this is quite unfair.
Thank you. That was very well put. I now have a question for Professor Wu, where the question is the rural-urban divide dated? Should the focus be on formalizing rural sector jobs?
Thank you, and thanks for the question, Reza. I definitely the rural-urban divide is not dated. It is still there, and that is also the reason why China, the national government of China, has initiated this rural vitalization strategy to develop the rural area. And among this strategy, a very important part is for the social, we say social public service online or in line with urban and rural. That is for people in rural and urban to enjoy the same public service, including education, healthcare, and public infrastructure, and so on. That is for the rural vitalization, especially for those newly poverty alleviated regions, that their welfare, their infrastructure, including housing and drinking water, have been improved enormously during the past 8 years. But still, the soft part, we say soft part, that is there, like the healthcare and education, still need to be improved. So that is the government still engaging a lot to improve the rural economy and the rural social indicators. For the formalizing the rural sector jobs, that I can't agree, because when we say the resilience of peasant life or peasant farming, peasant livelihood, the more the crucial part is upon their informal in the informal sector, how farmers produce and then market their products and their so as to create those resilient space for their life and for the rural society. So it's I personally I think it's not necessary to formalize this sector. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree with you more, because the one thing that we've learned and seen in the pandemic is the agricultural sector was the one sector that was impacted relatively less compared to others. And in some sense, this actually emerged as a reserve sector or the employer of last resort for many economies. So we definitely need to not neglect that area. And finally, there's a question for Dr. Kumaramangalam, and I think it's directed in the context of the discussion that happened a couple of months ago in the south of India. Has the time come for a government pension or monetary allowance for homemakers engaged in care work? Muted.
Properly. Could you just repeat your question? How can?
The question is, has the time come for a government pension or monetary allowance for homemakers engaged in care work?
I think that first of all, women's contribution in care work has to be taken into account, especially unpaid care work. What is being referred to in this question more is formal care work, like women who do nursing, maids who work in our homes, etc. What they need is some sort of social security where, yes, a pension scheme should be worked out, where employees and employers contribute, like all other pension schemes throughout the world. But what I think is equally, if not more important, is first for women to start being paid for the unpaid care work. Every mother, as my friend from Brazil was saying, we need to be told that yes, you're giving up your jobs, you're giving up your financial independence, you're in a sense, you have given up the opportunity to work if you're an educated woman for those childbearing and child rearing years. That's what I meant when I said initially facilitating, that women must be facilitated to work, whether it's in politics, whether it's in in business, whether it's in production, whether it's in agriculture, etc. And there first we need to see that women's work is actually recognized as work. Most women's work is not recognized as work. It's still unpaid work. We look after our children, our husbands, our families, our homes, our in-laws. I mean, the list is endless. And we never paid for it. Very rarely are we even thanked for it. Now, let me not go into that and provoke a lot of outrage from a lot of people. But first, we need to acknowledge that women do an enormous amount of unpaid work. Let us first, yes, simultaneously, we must talk of some form of, social, some sort of, whatever we can give them, even health. I'm talking about insurance, health insurance. All of this needs to be made available to women, specifically for women's needs, for women's health, for women's, the times when women need to take time off, whether it is to look after a sick patient at home or whether it is because they're going to have a baby. All these times, a social security network for women must be now a priority, and it should become a part of, yes, going forward developmentally too. But along with that, let us also acknowledge that women do an enormous amount of unpaid care work. And this too needs to be, I don't know how, I don't think anybody has put their minds to it in great detail in the world, but there has to at least be facilitating hand that is stretched out by the government, and only the governments can do this, and perhaps big corporations, which help women to stay at work. Because very often women are forced to give up jobs because of all the other commitments that they have. And, my colleague from Brazil, Marcela, was quite right when she said we are alone in this. Most women do it on their own. Yes, we have some sort of social support from our friends, sometimes from our families, etc. But no sustained or, I don't know how to say it, no sustained and no properly planned support is given to women at such times. So I would say that yes, we need social initiatives for women, social support initiatives, including pension. But equally importantly, if not more immediately, what we need is facilitative measures to help women get to work and stay at work.
Thank you. Thank you for those very powerful remarks. I now have one closing question, which is for all the panelists, and I'd request you all to answer it in just 30 seconds because we're running out of time. Can you provide one policy point that can be generalized across all countries to close the gender gap? And I'd like to start with Dr. Panova.
Thank you, Radhika. In addition to my first point on data and importance of data, I would like to say that we need to urge our governments to offer public investment and to elevate public investment into social infrastructure for women. This is of ultimate importance, and a certain percentage of GDP in accordance with national basic levels should be allocated to this point here.
Thank you. Professor Wu?
I would like to say equal education opportunity. That is, when we look back the development of China, and we can see that education has played an important, crucial role for women's development. When we go to the rural area at this moment, we very, very seldom see that women dropping out of girls dropping out of school because of that their parents didn't want them. It is usually because they are just tired of schooling. So when we interview those parents, they always say, as long as my son and my daughter wants to continue their schooling, I would like to support. And also by this policy that many rural women went out of the villages to cities, to other areas of China. And like for me, a rural girl became a professor in the university. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mosetsa?
I know that you said one, and I want to echo the sentiments of my friends. I think that quality education is very important. I think that social infrastructure is important. I think access to income for those who are in entrepreneurship is important. I, however, think that we need to prioritize a social, cultural rethink around how we treat our women in our different societies, and that requires a lot of political will, and also obviously protecting our most vulnerable, be that youth or even our children. I think that social cultural discussion is important and change is important. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Rizende?
I would like to just echo Victoria's words, which were quite perfect for the message I want to send here. We need social structure, and we need to improve our system of caring so that women can have better opportunities and better conditions to work and participate in the economy. That's pretty much as much as I can say. My baby's here now. It's quite a mess. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Kumaramangalam.
First, I'd like to agree with what all my four colleagues from the four other BRICS countries have said, and add not one, but just two. One is increased digitization, especially in social security issues and measures and policies, so that women actually are counted and that they're included. The second is a huge amount of increase in public safety for women. Once women start stepping out of their homes, public safety becomes a massive problem in many of our countries. And we need to invest heavily in that. We have to invest in it. It's not going to come automatically. whether it is by educating our children from a very young age, teaching them that violence against women is just not done, whether it is in, providing them safer spaces when they travel or when they are at rest, or, various other measures, safer spaces perhaps even at home, etc. All of this must be taken into account. Plus, of course, exactly what my 4 other colleagues said. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been an absolutely thrilling and lively discussion. We've had a lot of audience participation as well. So let me just conclude by saying we started this conversation on a somewhat pessimistic note, where we were talking about how women had borne a disproportionate burden of the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm coming out of this conversation so much more optimistic than I went into it. Because as you all spoke, it became apparent to me that women have made just excellent contributions as leaders, as health professionals, as first responders, as caregivers during this crisis. In fact, in many ways, this crisis has taught us that women are the best agents to engineer change and address new aspects of development in a society. With the right policies in place, and all of you all have offered many policy prescriptions, countries can rebuild stronger and more inclusively. As countries respond to the biggest challenge of our generation, they should view women as central builders of a strong post-COVID world. While we still have a long way to go to achieve gender equity, I think our inability to do so would indeed be a monumental mistake. And on that note, thank you all very much for joining in. Thank you.